God, I am looking crusty. Like, how do people do videos? Like, I'm constantly just also like I want to look at myself, but I know I need to look at the cat. Like, it's just hi, hi, it's me. Hi, welcome to the Utajua Hujui podcast with your girl Aileen. Now, this is going to be for the YouTube video. It is just the introduction, so that number one, you can see my lovely face. Number two, you can see the podcasting closet in all its glory, and number three, just so that I can like set this video up well, I think. Like, I'm not entirely sure if I want to do the whole YouTube hullabaloo, mainly because I'm the kind of person that when I do something, I want to do it right, which means giving it my all. And it is a lot of work that I'm not sure I want to begin, if you understand what I'm trying to say. But for now, please enjoy the audio version of this episode. I really hope you enjoy it. Use your imagination. It is God's gift to you. And thank you so much for giving me your time of day. And away we go. Hi, and welcome back to the Utajua Hujui podcast. Now, a quick word before we get in. Your girl Aileen has a little bit of a potty mouth, which means she does not mind her language and she speaks the fluent French. Which is all to say that I understand that some people are a little bit uncomfortable with this language, so here's just a warning for you. If, however, you are not uncomfortable and you would like to learn about the world around you and capitalism and colonialism and just like all this fun shit with a dazzling, brilliant, and funny host, if I do say so myself, keep listening. Hi, ho, hello, and welcome back to the Utajua Hujui podcast with your girl Aileen. How have y'all been? Hopefully, I hope you guys have been good. I hope you've been making it through these trying economic times. I hope our politicians have not been testing the living shit out of you like they have been testing the living shit out of me. And the reason I say that is because I'm constantly, and I know I shouldn't be. I should just come to expect this now. But I am constantly shocked at the misplaced priorities of our politicians. Because explain to me how, while we are in the middle of a cost of living crisis that you are basically ignoring, you are choosing to focus on the fact that suddenly queer people in Kenya, and by queer I mean LGBTQIA people in Kenya, have suddenly been given the right to represent themselves as like a human rights organization. And instead of focusing on lowering the cost of living, on spurring development, on growing our economy and creating opportunities for everyone, you are choosing to focus on the fact that gay people suddenly have representation that, by the way, does not extend to political representation in terms of in parliament, in terms of in the judiciary, in terms of in county governments. Like, it is just literally like this body has been formed and you guys are already losing your shit. I've seen that an MP has proposed a bill to criminalize homosexuality, as if that's not already illegal. Like, do you not? Just the misplaced priorities of our politicians is insane. And I feel like we are in the beginning of a moral crisis, a moral panic, which I don't quite have the words to yet represent how disappointed, frustrated, and ultimately just baffled at the state of our politicians. I really don't. Explain to me how you think that this is something that you will be rewarded for in heaven. That you think denying the human rights of another individual whose only crime in your eyes is to be queer, which is not a crime, right? It's not a crime. And you are choosing to demonize them, to focus on them instead of the rising cost of living. Do you really, like, what, however, has been giving me hope is that whenever I look at these comments and stuff on the posts on Instagram and Facebook and what have you, I'm seeing also a lot of Kenyans are pointing this out. A lot of Kenyans are like, dude, I don't care. But like, I can't afford to pay electricity. Fix it. I can't afford to buy food. Fix it. I don't care. And I think it's just weird that maybe I inhabit like a very, for want of a better word, inclusive social media sphere that allows me to engage with individuals who like think the same way that I do, right? Or maybe it's just the fact that Kenyans are just tired and they want their politicians to actually do something to help them instead of creating a moral panic that is designed to distract them from the real problem, right? Which is that our economy is being mismanaged. It has been mismanaged from the jump, and it has been mismanaged for the sake of Africa's political elite and multinational corporations. And that is where I want to begin today. But before we get there, you know what kind of podcast this is. This is a drink-friendly podcast, and today I am drinking Kericho Gold green tea and mint. Oh, it is my favorite tea in the world. If I could, I would intravenously consume it every single day. I drink this tea more than I drink water. Yeah, which is a real problem for me because like whenever I go to Mombasa, because of the heat and everything, you can't really have tea, and because I'm not used to the taste of water, I just kind of forget to drink water, so I end up being very dehydrated. So please drink water, drink something that is going to hydrate you is my thing. But before we get started, this is an episode about systems and the oceans in which we swim. Specifically how those systems affect every action undertaken within them, and the necessity of addressing these substructures as you are trying to pursue changes, policies, projects, and programs that are supposed to be beneficial. Today we are talking about James Finlay, and the recent report of sexual harassment happening on their farms. I wanted to give you context about what's going on, specifically the history of tea farming in Kenya, and also giving you wider context about Finlay's actions within the country as well. I want to do this to help you to understand that Finlay is not the problem. They are a problem, but they are not the problem. They are a symptom of a fucked up neocolonialist system that thrives on labor exploitation and willful ignorance of everyone involved, particularly the people in power. It's why stories about sexual harassment, deadly working conditions, and labor exploitation continue to be released about not only Finlay, but every MNC that is operating within the country, Facebook included, by the way. And firing the people that are the ones, directly being exploitative and directly harassing and being, basically dicks, does not stop it from happening because the system itself is corrupt, exploitative, and self-perpetuating. It is a perfect nesting ground for predators. So if we want to stop them, we need to change the system. Part of this includes holding them accountable for their crimes and committed in their name, but part of changing the system also means understanding the system itself and how it is constantly reinforced. Now, before we get into the episode, I do want to issue a warning for the sensitive material covered. We will be talking about instances of sexual harassment and assault, not to mention a light genocide in this episode. If it brings up any issues, please feel free to skip this episode and prioritize your mental health. Please also seek help for processing and unpacking what happened to you. It is not your fault. It is never your fault, and it will never be your fault. Responsibility lies with the perpetrator, always, period, end of sentence. Also, to give a balanced story, I will also highlight the good, if any, Finlay have done in their communities. As you can tell, I'm not particularly happy about it, simply because, I don't think that the good that they have done outweighs the bad that they have done. But, we are here. We're going to talk about it for the sake of a balanced narrative and for the sake of fairness as well. And I thought I would explain it now so that y'all aren't going to say, Aileen, you're being inconsistent. Nah. As I learned from John Green, the truth resists simplicity. So let's buckle the fuck in, and we're going to talk about everything. Yeah? So Kenya is the third or second largest tea producer in the world and the largest in Africa. 1 out of every 2 cups of tea drank in the UK is grown in Kenya. Hundreds of thousands of acres are dedicated to tea planting, and many of them are located in Kericho, Bomet, and Nandi, and some are in Nyeri. So basically the Rift Valley in central Kenya. Again, my knowledge of Kenyan geography is just abysmal. It is limited to the coast, Nairobi, and Shags. So please feel free to come for me because I know nothing. I am Jon Snow. Now, according to the Daily Nation, many of these hundreds of thousands of acres, which I will refer to as plantations or tea farms, but I prefer the term plantations given the labor exploitation that's happening within them. So many of these plantations are owned and operated by multinational companies, i.e. not Kenyans, who pay a land rate of 20 cents per acre per year. For comparison, my family, which lives in Nairobi, pays about 2,500 to 4,000 shillings per year in land rates, which means my family of 3 pays 10,000 times more in tax than a multinational corporation that brings in billions of shillings. How is that fair? The math is not mathing. Please make it make sense. Now, at this point, I'm pretty sure you're like, but Aileen, these companies own hundreds of thousands of acres. So even if they're paying 20 shillings, or rather 20 cents per acre in tax, it doesn't matter because cumulatively, they end up paying more. And I'm like, you're right, you have a point, except it is the principle of the thing. A multinational corporation should be paying more tax as part of its income than my family. How is it that my family has to pay more in tax per acre for land that is just alright, it's good land, than a multinational corporation that controls some of the most agriculturally productive land in the country? It's like you're saying that land is not as valuable as it actually is. Does that make sense to you? So 20 cents per acre per year is a fucking joke, especially for some of the most agriculturally productive land in the country. 20 cents per acre per year is gross. They should be paying more. They should be paying more. To add insult to injury, much of the tea that is produced on this land is not locally consumed. According to The Nation, and I quote, consumption of tea is still very low in Kenya, as it stands at about 8% of the total production annually. In the past few years, the consumption was at 4%. Now, the insult doesn't lie with this asymmetry, but in that, once again, we are not paid for this dominance and excellence. Tea pluckers earn about 8 shillings per kilogram of tea. This means they get paid 0.025 shillings per tea bag. 2 shillings out of every 80 bag box of tea, a box that retails for 457 shillings in the UK. Therefore, tea pluckers only make 0.43% of retail price, less than 1%, with the other 99 going to retailers, blenders like James Finlay, factories, traders and buying agents, and finally tea brokers. The tea farmers, who are the bedrock of this system, the entire reason everyone is able to make huge amounts of money from tea farming and agriculture, they get nothing for their labor, and that is fucked up. And this is the current state of affairs, close to 60 years after independence, which promised Kenyan people dignified labor and dignified lives. And the reason why the system has remained unchanged is because of some of the deals that were struck during the colonial era, and the fact that the system continues to benefit the people in charge, but also the people in charge of governing it also benefit from this fucked up system. So we need to kind of go back to how tea was introduced in Kenya, go back to the very beginning. Tea was introduced to Kenya in 1903 by a British man, G.W.I. Kane. He planted it as an ornamental plant in Limuru, which is in Kiambu, and its potential as an agricultural cash crop was not discovered until 1918, when Scotsman Arnold Butler planted it on a British government farm in Kiambedu in Limuru. With some experimentation, Butler cultivated 20 acres of tea, and thus the tea sector was born. Soon after, the British government banned Africans from cultivating tea themselves as an export or a cash crop. This ban would hold until the 1950s, where, the government, attempting to appease Africans, would allow us to start growing tea for export and as a cash crop, basically to say, look, we're not that bad. See, we pay attention to you. You guys don't need independence. Trust us. We're fine. We were not fine. Things were not fine. Anyway, onto tea growing locations. Kericho supplanted Limuru as the location to grow tea in this country, and this is when James Finlay enters the picture. Finlay, now owned by John Swire and Sons, was 175 years old by 1925 when it entered the Kenyan market. They began around, I think it was 1750, and they began as a textile trading company in Scotland. One of the fabrics they traded was cotton, and they soon switched from the cotton trade to the tea trade, and around 1861, after there was some supply issues with cotton coming in from the US, what with the ongoing civil war and the impact it had on the enslaved laborers. In 2008, and according to the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, Finlay had over 10,000 acres across 15 estates under cultivation, bringing in $500 million in revenue. Which is a lot of money, right? Which is a lot of money. Like, when you find out that Finlay was making $500 million in revenue, but the people who are enabling them to make that much money are only being paid 8 shillings per kilogram, how do you justify that? How do you justify that and attempt to say, or we are a good company, we are a good person? Like, this is why I don't like it when companies try to make us think that they are good and decent when the reality is they are profit-making enterprises that could not give a flying fuck about their CSR and only do it because it's good PR. Like, that's it. Right? It's very rare that a company engages in CSR or corporate social responsibility out of the goodness of their hearts, and more because it's fantastic PR, and also it allows them to get away with some of their more shitty things. A really good example for me is Bamburi Cement. Like, if you've ever been to Bamburi, that place is dusty. I live in Bamburi and I am constantly surprised that I don't have asthma because of how dusty that place is and how much like fine particles of cement just exist in the air. But they also, manage a 750-acre ecosystem thing that's called Hala Park, which I think helps them get away with, all the polluting that they're doing. But I digress. Finlay's first tea estate, plantation or farm, like I said, I'm going to use the word plantation, was in India. And in 1925, they turned their attention to Kenya after the British government basically began selling land for nothing and encouraging capital investment in the Kenya colony. This is clear from an ad selling Kenya in the 1930s, and I quote, "The Kenya colony makes a practical appeal to the intending settler with some capital. Its valuable crops give high yields due to the high fertility of the soil, adequate rainfall, and abundant sunshine. Secure the advantage of native labor to supplement your own effort." And I just want to focus on like the last bit of that promise, because central to the promise of the Kenyan dream, which is white settler success, was the abundance of native labor, which is a tad misleading because were there people? Yes. Did they all want to drop whatever it was they were doing to work for you white people? No. No. But all the colonizers saw were black bodies and just assumed. So the settlers came. And Finlay was among one of the companies that invested in Kenya at that time. Although at the time they were called the African Highlands Produce Company, but for the sake of consistency, I will refer to them as Finlay. Now, before we delve into the system of labor exploitation that enables the sexual harassment that we are currently being forced to deal with today, we need to talk about the land itself and how it is that Finlay got this abundant land. Because I don't know if you know, but it's not like the land was just here for the British to take. It belonged to people. So how exactly did the British get this land, eh? The answer is genocide. It's always something fucked up whenever the British are involved. I'm so sorry, but if you look at history, like, it's never good. And genocide is not my word. It is a word of a historian, who I will be heavily citing in this podcast episode. Still, prior to the tea company securing ownership of the land, it was owned by the Kipsigis, which is a subgroup of the Kalenjins. The land grab began when the British took the land to build a railroad from Mombasa to Kisumu. Towards the end of the line, the British ran into resistance from the Kipsigis and the Nandi. And despite the fact that both these communities knew the land and were fighting for a noble cause, they were outgunned by British military power. After all, as the saying goes, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. In 1905, 2,000 Kipsigis were slaughtered by the British. They were just lined up and massacred. In 1906, their leader, Kipchombe Arap Koilagen, was exiled to Mombasa after he rejected a British deal for peace. Arap Koilagen told the British that he wanted peace. That's all he wanted. But he didn't want to give up any land. And the British were like, oh, no, that's not how this is going to work. The British told him that they wanted his people off their land. Also, where do you get off making that proclamation, that demand? It is just peak colonizer energy. And the British said, if you, Arab Koilagen, convince your people to move from your land and just give it to us peacefully, we will move you to Tanzania. And here, again, I want us to just bask in the caucasity of this action, just how it radiates peak colonizer energy. Because explain to me, England, no, explain to me, come. Explain to me, how are you gonna give land you have no right to? How? It is not your land. Why are you trying to settle other people, like in somebody else's land? They're in creating not only competition for incredibly scarce resources in another country, but also sowing the seeds for ethnic conflict. Either you don't care or you knew exactly what you were doing and you didn't care, right? So to offer people that you wish to dispossess the dispossessed land of another community like it's all the same to you is peak colonizer energy. Unsurprisingly, Arab Coil again rejected their offer, and that's why he was exiled. And when he was exiled, the British began to steal more and more land. This theft only escalated after the First World War, where World War I vets were offered 25,000 acres of farmland per soldier. Oh, I'm sorry, not all World War I vets. No. The white ones. Only the white ones. The Kipsigis who had fought in World War I were denied access to the scheme for reasons that I'm sure have absolutely nothing to do with my inability to turn red in the sun. Reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I shine and radiate sunlight, meanwhile all of y'all turn pink like your crabs. I'm sorry for being petty, I really am. I just need a way to process the frustration and anger that I'm feeling, simply because it is a trip to go through history and to read this peak colonizer energy and to see it for yourself, but then to look at the current state of British education and realize that they are not teaching this to their children, which makes it all the more likely that they might do it again. Because you know somebody somewhere is itching, it's just fucking itching to do colonizer shit again. And if you don't educate your people correctly to understand why what they did was wrong, because I don't think they know what they did was wrong. I genuinely think they believe we brought civilization to the world and like everyone needs to thank us for it because like we did a good thing. Like, yeah, people died, but it was worth it for healthcare and education and technology and modern plumbing and sanitation. And it's like, you don't get to make that judgment call. You are not the one who suffered loss. We are. Only we get to make that judgment call, and the jury is still out, motherfucker. Anyway, yeah, so if you see me, or rather hear me being petty in this episode, I'm not being flippant. I am not making light of the situation. I'm coping in the best way I know how, which is to be petty. And I know I need better coping mechanisms. Trust me, I am trying to grow. But right now, for the sake of this episode, please bear with me. So it was in this environment, like this post-World War I environment, where white and only white settlers were getting 25-ish thousand acres per settler per farm for their farming activities. It is in this environment that Finlay acquired its land on a 99-year lease, which should be expiring in 2025. Again, they received this land under the promise of abundant and, most importantly, controllable native labour. So when the native labour naturally resisted, King George V signed an order banishing the Kipsigis to Guasi, on the shores of Lake Victoria, more than 80 miles away from their homes in Kericho. This is where the Guasi detention camp was born and where the genocide would occur. Guasi is a rough area full of snakes, mosquitoes, and flies, and the Kipsigis were forced to march to Guasi, a trek that took 2 weeks. While the colonizers were pulled by an ox and cart, the colonized were forced to walk on foot. According to historian David Ngasura-Tuey, by the time the Kipsigis got to Guasi, 14 women had had miscarriages. Miscarriages, no doubt, brought on by the stress of the move, the fear, physical exhaustion of having to walk for 2 weeks straight, the lack of food along the way, the lack of water along the way. Basically, I think these miscarriages were intentional on the part of the British. If not intentional, it was willful ignorance. Like, I don't care what happens, but I know what's likely to happen. Now, Tuey maintains that the British intended for the Kipsigis to die in Guasi so that they could control their land in Kericho. He argues the intentionality of this genocide is based on a memo he found in the UK National Archives. This memo, written by a colonial officer, records a plan, and I quote, "brutal as it may seem, to leave the old men to die out gradually in Gwasi," end quote. The officer added, and I quote, "I have little sympathy for the actual age group who made life so difficult for the government," end quote. And by so difficult for the government, what they mean is that these individuals were fighting for the right to their land, the land that the British had already assumed that they owned. Again, peak colonizer energy, to assume you have ownership rights to something you never had a right to. To this end, the British were meticulous in their record keeping. They carefully tabulated the community before deportation. The birth and death rates of the Kipsigis community were recorded annually, where for the rest of the country it was once a decade. And I hate to say this, but it worked, right? Because Finlay is currently cultivating tea on that plantation that used to belong to the Kipsigis. This is the price of your tea. To anyone listening in the UK, let me remind you that 1 out of every 2 cups of tea that you drink comes from Kenya, comes and is grown in my country. And the price of that tea is the intentional and willful murder of an entire generation of a community, just so that somebody can make a profit, just so that somebody can make money. Is it worth it? The British government seemed to think so, because in 2021, and according to Vice, the British High Commission invited representatives from the 3 largest tea multinationals in the country, Finlay included, to an event designed to schmooze with the gatekeepers of the tea industry in the country. Now, this event was absolutely necessary, at least in the eyes of the British High Commission and the tea multinationals, because in 2019, the National Land Commission refused to renew Finlay's license and basically said that the land that they owned had to be held in trust for the community that it was stolen from. Now, I'm not sure if the Kenyan government will actually go through with it. I really do not trust the Kenyan government right now to actually do something that benefits its people. But it speaks volumes that the second after you have this ruling in 2019, as soon as they are able, which is 2021, COVID, you have the elites of the industry basically going to the gatekeepers and trying to schmooze them and trying to get them to do something different, trying to get them to figure out what their new legal position is, basically trying to ensure that they retain their dominance over an inherently exploitative industry, an industry built off the backs of forced dispossession, deportation, and murder. And I just find it really funny that then you have James Finlay turning around and saying, we are a community-oriented organization that really values our labor. No, you don't. You value the money they give you, but you don't actually value the laborers themselves. You value the wealth they create for you, but you don't value the people who are actually working, and it is fucking disgusting. But before I move on to talking about the labor itself, I do also want to note that recently the survivors of this genocide filed suit with the British government for £178 billion, just for compensation for everything that they've done. So good luck, British government. I bet you really thought this was never going to come and bite you in the ass. I really wonder, while you were doing all your colonizing shit, if it ever occurred to you that people would be pissed off, or you just figure that even if people are pissed off, it doesn't matter, because you're Britain and it's going to be fine. Actions have consequences. Never forget that, sir. Now, on to labor. Specifically the labor that was working these farms. Initially, the Kipsigis were supposed to work these farms, but, they were marched off to die in Gwasi. So labor was then imported from other parts of the country, central Kenya in particular. You see the seeds of ethnic conflict being sown. It's just from as early as 1925, we see Finlay using contractors to handle their labor. By the way, today they also use contractors to handle their labor. They do this because it not only reduces administrative costs, but it also limits their liability. After all, if your contract is not with the workers, but with the company who hired them, then technically, you owe the workers nothing. Nothing but the bare minimum. So to help drive men to work, the British used the stick while Finlays used the carrot. The stick was the state imposed taxes on households that could only be paid in cash, not in kind. And this created a need for cash, which drove Africans to work. It also introduced Africans to wage labor and capitalism. Yay. But the wages were fixed at such low rates because they needed to maintain Kenya's international competitiveness. And as a result, even as the colony of Kenya grew wealthy, its African workers grew poorer. And the point here I'm trying to make is that even from the very beginning, the substructure of the tea industry is cheap, like unnecessarily, ridiculously cheap labor that does not care about the people working and the financial obligations that they need to meet. Now, on the other hand, in order to attract more workers to their farms, Finlay used the promise of education. They built schools on these plantations. Unfortunately, the tea estate schools were not great at their jobs, like almost as if a multinational organization might not give a flying fuck about educating and subsequently empowering the vulnerable workforce. But who can say? The school was not well attended, and those who went to school received substandard education. Many graduates left without being able to read and write, although they could all read the Bible, #priorities. The plan for this school was to create the next batch of managers and supervisors, but they failed so abysmally that at independence, when the new government insisted that Africans take up managerial roles, Finlay had to look outside their own estates, or rather plantations. I will say that right now, it looks like Finlay are trying to do better. A 2008 review of their plantations by the Kenya Human Rights Council revealed that the company built 16 primary schools, 1 day secondary school. By 2022, this figure rose to 5 daycare centers, 31 early childhood development centers, 12 primary schools, and 2 secondary schools, Marian and Chemasingi, I think. Teacher housing is also available and is maintained by Finlay. Finlay also offers scholarships to its students, and in 2022, 20 students were awarded scholarships worth 4 million shillings. According to the Finlay Community Trust, and I quote, "To date, the 3 scholarship programs have benefited 566 secondary school students, 372 undergraduate students, and 21 graduate students at a cost of 241 million shillings, end quote. Now that sounds really impressive, but let me just contextualize that figure for you for a second. In 2008, the company made $500 million on their estates in Kenya. Using this figure as a reference point, these scholarships worth 240 million shillings represent a mere 0.4% of the money made from exporting Kenyan tea. Less than a fucking percent was given back in terms of scholarships, and yet they have the fucking gall to pat themselves on the back. Bro, are you being serious right now? Back to education. Perhaps the reason why the school failed was because Finlay kept taking students under the age of 18, children. They kept taking children out of school to pluck tea. Yeah, they use child labor. This is a practice that they would allegedly continue into the 21st century. Although Finlay were cleared of child labor allegations in 2008 by the Kenya Human Rights Council, these allegations resurfaced in 2019 when Finlay's contractors were accused of employing child labor in their estates in Kericho and Bomet. Finlay obviously denies the allegations, affirming its commitment to stop all instances of child labor in its 2021 modern slavery statement. But we still need to consider why it was in the past that Finlay was willing to employ child labor. Now, it's because children can do the same amount of work for less money, but more importantly, it's because children are a lot easier to control than adults. Children are a lot more trusting of authority figures, a lot more fearful of authority figures, and a lot less capable of questioning authority, especially when you keep pulling them out of school to do fucking work, James Finlay. Anyway, the use of child labor, whether or not it was quote-unquote justified by racism, which itself is not a reason, is indicative of the pervasive and corrupting nature of the profit-seeking motive. It does not matter that everyone was doing it, because, as my mother would say, if your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? This profit-seeking motive would underpin and characterize the industry in its infancy. In fact, it would create a bedrock, a justification for an exploitative system that is designed to extract as much profit as possible while not giving a flying fuck about labor. And as a result, the conditions for the workers were abysmal. Quoting from Sally Koskay, and I quote, "The outbreak of various types of meningitis throughout the 1930s also demonstrated that the living conditions were inadequate. Cases of cerebral meningitis were reported from James Finlay in 1933. In the following year, 14 cases of cerebrospinal meningitis, all fatal, occurred on their tea estates. It is significant to note that not a single case of this disease was reported from the reserve, where the Africans were housed. Meningitis is thought to have been caused by overcrowding," end quote. Now remember that in addition to providing an education, or rather, the promise of providing an education, Finlay attracted a lot of its workers by promising housing. But the housing was so poor that you were likely to get sick on a plantation than you were on a reserve, where the conditions were, not great. So that just goes to show you just how little Finlay, in the very beginning, cared about its labor. Now, at the time, around the 1930s, Finlay only had one hospital, and that was manned by one doctor. This improved, and by 2008, Finlay had built a hospital with a bed capacity of 106, that was run by trained medical staff, plural, and they had 19 health centers and 2 dispensaries. But now the question is, can the workers use these facilities? Turns out the answer is no. Not if you are hired through contractors, which many of them are. In 2019, a worker called Joel Toe lost his right eye while working on a James Finlay plantation. A sharp branch that had accidentally sprang up broke his goggles and pierced through his cornea. My God. Because he wasn't a James Finlay employee, not technically, he was not allowed to use the company's health facilities. And as a result, he was forced to go to the hospital, and he incurred a 20,000 shilling bill, where, remember, he was only paid 8 shillings per kilogram, or roughly, I think it was maximum 900 to 1,000 shillings a day, which is not that much money. Like, he would have had to work 20 days to pay off that hospital bill, which is insane, especially when they had a hospital on site. But Toe could not use that hospital because he was not a Finlay employee. He was a contracted employee, which means that any rights and obligations that James Finlay owed him did not have to be realized because technically he was not their employee. Is that not shady to you? Does that not scream like the conditions for exploitation are ripe in this industry? And you would think that following independence, things would get better. But unfortunately, this system was never really addressed. The system of land acquired through acts of violence, worked by laborers who their full rights as employees are not realized because they are contractors, right? And are therefore exploited by a large multinational corporation. Like, this system was never really addressed. In fact, it was allowed to continue undeterred. And this is because tea is incredibly profitable for the Kenyan state. After independence, tea was Kenya's 3rd largest export after coffee and sisal. It was responsible for bringing in 25% of our foreign exchange by the 1970s, and yet it was an industry that was dominated by British multinational corporations who controlled the export of tea, which allowed them to dictate terms because they were the ones exporting tea, which means they are the ones responsible for bringing in 1/4 of our foreign exchange reserve. Money that we need in order to pay off debts, buy oil, fund infrastructure, or basically keep the economy afloat, right? Which meant that Finlay and Co. were integral to the functioning of the Kenyan economy. And as the saying goes, if they said jump, the Kenyan government would ask, how high? In fact, even last year, in 2021, the last year for which we have reliable records, tea brought in 130 billion shillings in export revenue. This is over $1 billion and 22% of Kenya's foreign exchange for that year. If a single industry dominated by multinationals is responsible for bringing in the huge chunk of change that you use to buy oil, pay debts, and get other cool shit, are you really going to be quick to fuck with it? Are you really, as a state, going to be so quick to mess with what is essentially a winning formula? History suggests that the answer is no, and this is clear from how infrequently James Finlay are held responsible for the crimes and injustices that occur on their plantations. In 2016, over 20,000 tea workers, close to 50% of their staff, held a 2-hour protest in Kericho over salaries and allowances disputes. The strike was a response to Finlay's rejection of a ruling by the Employment and Labour Relations Court, which raised employee salaries and allowances by 30% and set the retirement age to 60. Yeah, by the way, Finlay wanted these guys to basically work forever, which again is just peak colonizer energy, because how can you think that, number one, you are entitled to that labor? You're entitled to those extra years, number one. Number two, Finlay, your own fucking employees are allowed to retire at 60, at 60 to 65. And yet you do not extend that same privilege to the people who are responsible for your wealth. When I tell you this system of exploitation goes down to the very bedrock of how they interact and engage and the assumptions they make of the tea workers in Kericho, Bomet, and Nyeri, I am not shitting you. They genuinely see these people as nothing more than a resource for them to exploit for as long as humanly possible. Now back to this protest. These protesters said that Finlay had been encouraged to reject the ruling from the Employment and Labour Relations Court by the Kenya Tea Growers Association, or KTGA, which is a trip and a half. For the KTGA is an organisation designed to promote the industry to benefit all Kenyans. And it's weird that the Kenya Tea Growers Association allegedly told one of its members to ignore an order that would have benefited Kenyans. Allegedly. Again, doing a lot of heavy lifting, that word. And here we need to talk about the KTGA and the Kenya Tea Development Agency, or the KTDA. Upon independence, Kenya's tea sector could be divided into two: small-scale farmers, represented by the KTDA, and the expansive plantations, represented by the KTGA. Given that the latter is dominated by multinational companies, the KTGA basically functions as a union for British companies, a way for them to have a seat at the table that they fucking own while denying their workers the same privilege. Meanwhile, the KTDA is for small-scale farmers, and it unfortunately actively exploits its members. In 2015, over 1,000 farmers filed a case against the KTDA, accusing them of siphoning 93 billion shillings of their earnings without their consent for the last 15 years, so basically since 2000. In 2017, over 8,000 farmers sought to basically leave the KTDA because the agency had interfered with the elections of directors, thus resulting in directors who did not act in favor of tea farmers. It seems that both the KTDA and the KTGA exist to protect the industry from the people and labour, to maintain the current state of exploitative affairs, a state which Finlay benefits from. These agencies understand the fundamental rule of business, which is that you never, ever, ever fuck with money, because money always fucks back. And basically these two agencies also reinforce a system that allows Finlay to basically do whatever they want as long as they apologize, half-heartedly at that. Case in point, in 2008. In 2008, the Kenya Human Rights Commission recorded instances of sexual harassment at James Finlay's estates. Did you really think the recent allegations, 2023, are the first ones? No, this happened 15 years ago. 2008, man. The commission said that the complaints of sexual harassment and assault were by far the most prevalent when they spoke to tea farm workers. But Finlay continues to deny the prevalence of this problem, associating it with individual actors who can be fired, and once they leave, everything will be fine. But the problem keeps coming back. Quoting from the report in 2008, and I quote, "The James Finlay management conceded that sexual harassment was a major issue in the past. However, it has been dealt with. The management noted that a gender and sexual harassment policy had been developed, and the company was in the process of setting up gender committees, which could be mandated to handle cases of sexual harassment," end quote. How's that policy working out for you, James Finlay? Clearly, not very well. Not when you have a policy that does not extend to your contractors. Now, it's all well and good for you as a company to have a policy that is against all these awful things. However, if you continue to use a system of labor that employs contractors to separate your liability from theirs, and you don't make sure that your policies and extend to them, you don't make sure that the contractors that you are hiring are actually the shit and are actually going to be the best for your laborers, then you just don't care. And the reason I'm not gonna buy the how are we supposed to know argument is because you are James Finlay. This is not the first time you're using contractors. You've been using contractors to secure your labor since the very beginning of your operations in Kenya, which means you ought to have really good programs and policies and vetting processes in place to make sure that they are the shit. And the fact that at least once a decade we are told of sexual harassment cases, and this is just what we know. This is just what we see when we get a glimpse once every 5 to 10 years. We don't know what the day-to-day reality is like. But if this problem keeps resurfacing over and over and over again, you cannot keep saying that it is individual actors anymore. You can't, because now you have to bear some responsibility for not doing your fucking jobs in vetting these contractors, in participating in a system that allows you to be this negligent so long as you continue to make a profit. And this takes us to 2019, when accusations of sexual harassment and assault were once again leveled against James Finlay's contractors. And then again, 2023, where these allegations resurfaced again. The only difference is the source. This time, the BBC reported on what was going on in James Finlay's plantations, and it is a harrowing tale of abuse of power and the willful corporate negligence and ignorance. Now, I'm not going to go in depth into that story, and I would fully suggest you watching the BBC documentary. I've put the link in the description. Again, it does have a lot of sensitive material, so if it is triggering for you, please feel free to not watch it. Prioritize your mental health. But I will summarize it here for you. According to the BBC, more than 70 women in 2 Kenyan farms, one run by James Finlay, had been sexually abused by their supervisor. Specifically, and in the context of James Finlay, Mr. John Chebuchok and Mr. John Asava. In the video that you're going to watch, Chebuchok is the man that we see sexually harassing the undercover reporter. He's the man in the video who says, "We are adults, take off your clothes." And I don't like the fact that it's becoming a meme. Taken out of context, it's quite funny, but placed into its context, I don't want to make light of exactly what's going on, because we should never forget that those words represent an abuse of power that has been the daily reality of so many women who felt like they could not go to Finlay themselves. Or maybe they went to Finlay and they were just ignored, right? So Chebuchok had been working on Finlay's plantations for more than 30 years, first as an estate manager and then as the owner of the contracting company. He had already been flagged as a predator. And like I said, what he was doing was as simple as it comes. He says, if you want the job, sleep with me. If you want X, sleep with them. If you want to keep your job, sleep with me. Refuse and you lose their job. And in an economic environment where job opportunities are scarce, and for some fucking reason we all got scammed into paying to live on this planet with abundant resources, it is mind-boggling that he chooses to use that economic environment to abuse his workers rather than to figure out a way to empower them. The fact that this man, Mr. Chebuchok, felt so comfortable propositioning a woman whom he wanted to hire on his second interaction with her speaks volumes. Either he knew that he would get away with it, or he didn't care, or both. It speaks to a truly unsafe and toxic working environment and culture, a culture that has persisted for the last 30 years in spite of James Finlay's sexual harassment policy, a culture that relies upon disempowered workers who exist to be exploited in every way, shape, and form. Firing these 2 men, Chebuchok and Asava, will not change this culture. DCI and Finlay investigating this issue again will not change this culture. But watch both Finlay and the state blame individual actors rather than a system that enables such actors and benefits them both. So where does this leave us? No, really, I've given you a lot of information. I've given you so much context about the history of Kenya's tea industry, about how it is inherently colonial and that this colonial system has been perpetuated either actively or implicitly for the last 60-ish years. Where does this leave us? Well, let's start with James Finlay, right? Finlay seemed to be suffering some consequences. Starbucks have suspended their contract with them, but Tesco and Sainsbury's have not. It is unclear if they will. It is unclear if they will continue to buy tea from Finlay's plantations in Kenya. So they seem to be facing some repercussions. It just sucks that the only kind of pain that they will feel is not fucking rage, but a light slap on the wrist. Like, they'll lose a couple of contracts, but they'll get them back once they do a huge PR campaign saying that, like, we are great, we fixed our issues. And in this PR campaign, you know they're going to feature black bodies. You know the spokesperson is going to be some, like, Kenyan mama who's very humble and, like, has been planting and growing tea for all her life. And it's going to be so calculated that it's going to hurt. But you and I both know that Finlay are going to make a comeback. You and I both know that unless the Kenyan government actually does something drastic, they will not suffer a lot of consequences from this. But it is weird that it took Starbucks, or rather it took the BBC reporting on this issue, for Starbucks to suspend their contract with Finlay. Because, as I said, the Daily Nation has reported on this, the Star has reported on this, but it took specifically a British-owned media company to report on this issue for Starbucks to take notice, especially because Starbucks could have very easily uncovered Finlay's history of allegations of sexual harassment on their plantations. It took me a week. And if I had more time, I would have done deeper research into getting, more cases and more evidence. And Starbucks is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You mean to tell me that they couldn't do the work? And it's because they don't want to. It seems like the only reason they've cancelled their contract is that it's a bad look. Specifically, that it is a bad look internationally, right? I mean, they didn't cut ties with Finlay in 2019 when Finlay was sued by tea workers, claiming damages for serious chronic health issues. They didn't cut ties with Finlay when Finlay retaliated against these workers for filing these claims and fired them, which is fucked up, right? They didn't cancel or suspend their contracts with Finlay when earlier this year a 9-year-old boy was decapitated on one of their plantations. So how, I just find it really difficult to feel good about their actions when it's very clear that it's a PR move. It's motivated not by this intrinsic need to do good, but this intrinsic need to look good. And the problem with even having these contracts be suspended is because somebody else will just come in to take that place. Someone else who's going to do the exact same shit but just hide it better. And this is because the system is fucked. The system does not allow for meaningful change that benefits the people because those changes are not immediately profitable. We know that paying people more increases worker well-being, which increases productivity. That's just a fact. But as a capitalist, why would you risk lowering your profit margin when you're already getting the most for the least right now? What motivates James Finlay to make any changes for the benefit of their workers? What motivates the government? What inspires them to make any changes when it also benefits them too? This system of exploitation also benefits them. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the system is fucked. Tea farming in Kenya is built on colonial exploitation, cultivated literally on stolen land for the benefit of companies far, far away. These companies are responsible for bringing in close to $1 billion, 130 billion shillings in foreign revenue that this government desperately needs to pay off its debts. So do you really think they're going to do the kind of shit that needs to be done to stop this from ever happening again? The kind of systemic, ground up, to use their terminology, bottom up change that they need to do to make sure this never happens again. Investigating these crimes is not enough. firing Chibok and Asak, I think both Johns, is just the beginning of solving this problem. You need bottom-up change, right? Now, I don't have a problem with MNCs. I mean, I am deeply skeptical and suspicious of them, but I don't have a problem with them. The problem is that they take and take and take without giving anything back. And the amount of capital that they invest and the amount of capital that they control allows them to have a say in government policy, a much bigger say than the citizens of Kenya. Ngugi wa Thiong'o expertly communicates this problem in I Will Marry You When I Want. And I quote, "The little amount of money they give us, we give back to them. It is the profit of our work on our blood they take to Europe to develop their own countries. If all the wealth we create with our hands remained in the country, what would we not have in our village? Good public schools, good houses for the workers, good houses for the peasants, and several other industries. To have factories and even big industries is good, very good. It is a means of developing the country. The question is this: who owns the industries? Who benefits from the industries? Whose children gain from the industries?" The fact that James Finlay is a huge part of a machine that contributes a lot of money to our economic structure means that I do not trust the Kenyan government to do what needs to be done. I don't trust them to take their duty to secure the welfare of Kenyan citizens seriously. I don't trust them to fix the system that enables this kind of exploitation, that enabled 30 years of sexual harassment by a man who was already a recognized predator, Mr. Chibok. I don't trust them to fix it, because doing so might risk James Finlay leaving. And I'm sure as shit the Kenyan government doesn't want that to happen. So now my question is this to you. Do you trust the Kenyan government to do what needs to be done? Do you trust this government to put the needs of its people, the need and the right to participate in dignified labor, to have a dignified life, above the needs and whims of foreign multinational corporations? Or do you expect a bargain to be struck? A utilitarian bargain where the one will be sacrificed to benefit the many once again? Thank you so much for listening, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit and ruminate with me. I hope this makes sense. If it doesn't, please feel free to reach out. We can talk about this further. I'm worried it doesn't make sense because I've had to be expeditious, word of the day, with this episode, just to make sure it's out in a relevant time when we're still having this discussion. But let me know what you think, please. I'm looking forward to that conversation. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming in the next episode. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to the Utajua Hujui podcast. I really appreciate you giving me your time of day. I know that your time is very valuable. If you'd like to connect with me, you can find me on Instagram at utajuahujui.pod. That is at utajuahujui.pod on Instagram. Please don't forget to like, share, review, do all the nice things. I could really use the boost. Okay, enjoy the rest of your time on this planet. Goodbye.